Okay, everyone. Hope you're doing well. I think we're going to get started. My name is Eric Iverson. I'm just going to talk really quickly about what this Texas Tropical Network Initiative is, and then we're going to hear really briefly from Jill Parrish from the UT Green Fund, who's one of our main sponsors. So we started the Texas Tropical Network basically to bring people together across different disciplines, across different universities, who have a common focus on conservation and sustainable development in the tropics. And I know that we have people just here at UT from the Department of Biology, Geography and the Environment, Anthropology, even linguistics, who work on issues that are actually really similar, but often we don't talk to each other. So part of the goal of this initiative is to bring people together across departments, but also with other universities in Texas, with the general interested public, and with the people who are actually leading in the conservation space, whether that's Indigenous people, nonprofit leaders, entrepreneurs. So thank you so much for being here. And I want to let you know that we have a website, texastropicalnetwork.org, where you can find a form. You can sign up there if you want to be part of the listserv. We have two more events with Rhett this week that I wanted to let you know about. So tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in the School of Journalism, DMC 2.106, that's the second floor of the School of Journalism building off of Dean Keaton. We're going to be talking about reporting from nature's front line, the state of environmental journalism. So we'll hear from Rhett, and then we'll have a little bit of interview Q&A session. Then on Thursday at 4 p.m., Rhett's going to be talking about the state of the world's tropical forests, again in this room, 4 p.m. on Thursday. I want to thank the sponsors who made this possible. Farah Coffee will be doing coffee for us on Thursday. The Lilas Brazil Center here at the university has provided some funding. The School of Journalism and Media is working with us. The Green Fund, our primary sponsor, who made all of this possible, and the Biodiversity Center here at the University of Texas. So I'm going to let Jill Parrish come up here and talk a little bit about what the Green Fund is, so you can all know about that, and then I'll introduce Rhett and we'll be on our way.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. As Eric mentioned, my name is Jill Parrish, and I actually work here at UT in the Office of Sustainability. A lot of people don't know that we exist, but we are a staff team of 4, and our job is to make UT a greener place. And we do that in a variety of ways. We work with faculty, students, staff on various initiatives, policy, working with students who are interested in getting more sustainability in the curriculum and helping, introduce them to folks that can make that happen. We have the largest, or we sponsor the largest environmental student org on campus, the Campus Environmental Center, which is a collection of students across campus. We have 5 teams that work on projects that are paid, that have paid employees that work on campus to make improvements. So we have a lot of different things going on. We have a climate leaders program that provides undergraduate opportunities, also paid positions, to work with different departments on campus to do carbon footprint analysis and make suggestions on how to reduce their carbon footprint. So we work with students in a variety of ways. And our director works mostly on the policy side and with the president's office, and there's a president's sustainability steering committee that he oversees. So I just want to give you just like a general overview of how we work on campus. My primary job is to manage the Green Fund grant program, and I want to make sure that you're all aware of that because it's a funding source that's available to students, faculty, and staff for environmental research and projects. It was started 12 years ago through a student initiative. Undergraduates lobbied the legislature to get approval to assess a fee. At that time, it was a fee that students paid into, but we needed legislative authority to do that. And they had students from all over the state call their reps to get the bill out of committee and get approval to do that. So it was a large scale activist movement, really, that allowed us to have this program. Since that time, the legislation has expired and it's no longer a fee, and it's but fortunately it still exists truly at the desire of the president. So we now exist through a student allocation. So there's a, it's a $5 allocation, more or less, that comes from every student on campus that pays tuition. And that translates into about $500,000 of student tuition that comes to our office in this fund that we then award out to you all. It is a competitive grant program, and it truly is a competition. But because it is student tuition as the funding source, we have a student majority committee that decides what gets funded. They review every application that comes through. They're trained how to do that. It's a student leadership opportunity. If you're interested in serving on that committee, please let me know. We actually have 3 openings this year. You can serve up to 2 years. Then there are 6 students, so it's a combination of undergraduate and graduate students that serve on that committee, and we have 3 appointed faculty and staff that are appointed by the president's office. And then I serve as an advisor, as does my director. We go to every meeting. It's pretty labor intensive in the spring, just so you know. If you're interested, it's a weekly 2-hour meeting in the spring semester. If you're interested in applying, the average grant rate ranges from 10,000 and can be up to 40,000. So they're fairly small grants, but they are awarded across disciplines. We have funded zero waste theater productions and individual student research. There's an individual student research grant opportunity up to $2,500 for undergraduates, up to $5,000 for graduate students. For your individual research. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. I have flyers on the back. That's also the email that you can learn more about the Green Fund, but you can just email greenfund at UTexas, at austin.utexas.edu. But it's a wonderful opportunity to support your research and also any projects that you can dream up. There are butterfly gardens on this campus as a result of the Green Fund, and solar panels, and transportation studies, and actually the School of Communication, Moody, some graduate students in that school have received grants to do studies on the best methods to communicate with students about these issues. So please keep us in mind. The large grant opportunity, and in addition to the undergraduate and graduate funding opportunities, that application opens November 6th. It is an online application. It'll be due February 11th, and then they'll be reviewed all semester long. If you're awarded funds, the funds would become available in the summer. You would need to create an internal account to receive those. We don't award directly to the students and faculty. It all goes into a campus account, but I can work with you on that if you're interested in learning more about that. So that's the structure. That's how it works. You can pay salaries, student salaries out of it. It doesn't pay tuition, but it does pay student salaries. And it can fund up to 1 month of faculty salary. So just keep that in mind. The reason it doesn't fund tuition is because it is a fairly small pocket of money, and it would go too quickly to fewer projects. We wouldn't be able to fund as many projects if we did that. So that was a decision the committee made. Anyway, sorry, I'm kind of rambling, but I just wanted to introduce myself and let you know that we exist. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So once again, a big thank you to the Green Fund for making this possible. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Rhett Butler, the founder of Mongabay. So if you have been following Mongabay as long as I have, you've seen this website grow from something much smaller to one of the world's leading sources of environmental journalism. And the story here is that Rhett founded Mongabay in 1999, basically by himself, as a website to share information about tropical rainforests and tropical aquarium fishes. And soon he was writing environmental journalism all by himself and creating basically a huge amount of content. And this website started to grow, generate ad revenue, and eventually get some staff members. And it was so successful that it was able to start expanding reporting to other countries. And Rhett really understood that, there were places on Earth where there was a need for deep investigative reporting to help protect the environment, and that this could have a real impact on the world. And one of the ways that he did this was to both incorporate the website as a nonprofit so that they could start generating alternative sources of funding from just ad revenue, and also to begin operating inside of Indonesia and publishing in Indonesian Bahasa, so that they could reach an audience in a country where deforestation was a huge problem, corruption was rampant in the environmental sector, and this kind of reporting can make a difference. And pretty soon, one started to see real world impacts of Mongabay's reporting, investigations that led to projects being canceled or investigated, things of that nature. And they kept growing and expanding to other countries. In 2019, they began operating Mongabay Brazil. And others have begun recognizing the impact that this website has had on the environmental world. And so in 2014, Rhett received the Field Museum's Parker Gentry Award for having a significant impact on preserving the world's natural heritage. If you've ever worked in Peru, you probably recognize those names and understand how significant that award is. Mongabay now reports through 5 bureaus from 70 countries in 10 languages with over 50 staff and over 800 correspondents. And just this year, Rhett received the Heinz Award for outstanding contributions to the environment. So we're so thrilled to have Rhett here today to talk to us. And thank you very much for your presence. I'll let Rhett take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Eric, thank you for putting this all together. Yeah, so it's exciting to be here. So I'll just jump right in. In terms of the structure, so I was going to give a little bit of background on Mongabay. I think it'd be helpful for understanding the journey and sort of how serendipity can lead to interesting things. And then get a little bit into some things I've learned about communicating science to different audiences, which I think can be helpful even if you're not a scientist and really with whatever career you go into. So just a quick background on Mongabay beyond what Eric just generously provided. So Mongabay really focuses on the intersection of people and nature in geographies where we feel like journalism can have an impact. So we tend to focus mostly in the tropics. It's not that we don't have environmental issues in the United States, but they tend to be better covered here than they are in a place like Indonesia or Colombia. We're structured with 6 regional bureaus across 6 languages currently. We've actually expanded to 90 staff, so we're growing, and about 1,000 contributing journalists in about 80 countries. We produce content in written format, video, and audio in the form of podcasts. We are a nonprofit. I'll get a little into that later, but we primarily get either grants from foundations or donations from individuals. Ad revenue is less than 0.1% of our revenue now, so it's become very small. And we distribute via our website. So we have about 4 million monthly visitors coming to our website. It varies a bit. Social media, and then third-party sites. So all of our content is available for anyone to use commercially or non-commercially for free. So that means in some places, there are a lot of mainstream media outlets that are republishing our stories. So I'll just start with the backstory of Mongabay. So I've always been really interested in nature. Specifically, I like reptiles and amphibians. So as a kid, I would look at books and we'd see that kind of the most interesting herps or reptiles and amphibians tended to be in the rainforest. So, or I guess the most abundance of them. And so I would always be talking about the rainforest and trying to get my parents to take me to the rainforest. I had the benefit of having a mother who's a travel agent who focused on international travel, and a father who traveled a lot for business, so a lot of airline miles. And so my family did prioritize travel growing up, and eventually I got to visit some rainforests. The thing that moved me from someone who liked cool frogs to really being aware of what was happening in the environment was after a trip to Ecuador. And so I stayed, my family, this is when I was about 12, my family went to this area near Yasuni National Park, which is one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. And we stayed with a fairly traditional indigenous community, and I had an amazing time, finding frogs, going fishing, things like that. I came home, and a few months later, there was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle about an oil spill that happened on the Rio Napo, upriver from where I'd been. And so what that meant is that the area I visited was now affected by oil. And so I wondered what had happened to my friends in the forest and the animals. And so that's what led me to really start to read the news and read books about what was happening to the environment, but specifically rainforests. The thing that moved me to action was when I was in high school, I had an opportunity to visit Borneo, so specifically Malaysian Borneo. And I had another, well, first of all, this forest is very biodiverse. So it's full of all sorts of interesting herps, of course, but interesting insects and birds. And I had a really amazing experience when a wild orangutan passed while I was sitting by a creek, and I was picking the leeches off my legs, and this just orangutan just kind of passed overhead, probably 40 feet away, and he kind of stopped for a second and then kept going. And it was just, I felt like I had a bond, even though I'm sure he didn't care whatsoever that I was there. But that was a moment for me. I kept in touch with the scientists there, and this is actually like letter writing. It was before I had access to the internet. But I found out that forest was eventually pulped to make paper, and then it became an oil palm plantation. And so with that forest destruction, it just inspired me to want to raise awareness about what was happening in tropical forests. So when I was in college, I should say, so it went from looking like this to looking like this. So I was in college, I began writing a book about tropical rainforests. So my major was actually management science economics, which is like math and econ basically, and some finance. But I was very passionate about tropical forests. And so I spent a lot of time in the library and talking with experts to put together this book. And thanks to AP credit from high school, I was able to finish college year early. And so I spent that extra year finishing the book, pitching publishers, doing things like that. Eventually, a publisher came back to me, said they were interested. The book went through peer reviews. They came back and said, okay, we're ready to publish this book, but because we're an academic press, we don't have the budget to put pictures in it. And so to me, that defeated the purpose really defeated the purpose of what I was trying to do, which was convey the beauty of rainforests. And so I thought, well, I didn't write this book for money, I wrote it for impact. And so I decided to put the text up online so people could read it for free. And I decided to name it Mongabay, which is derived from the name of an island off Madagascar. So this is another special place for me. So this is an island covered in rainforest. It actually been completely deforested, but the forest came back, and it's full of all sorts of amazing creatures. And then it's surrounded by coral reefs, and you have a population of humpback whales that breeds there. So again, a really amazing place. I chose the name Mongabay because it was completely unique. So if you went to Alta Vista or whatever you used for searching back then, you typed in Mongabay, the only thing it would come up with would be the website and references to it. So it was an easy way to track it. But I wasn't going to run a website for a living, so I got a real job. I returned to Silicon Valley and started working for a startup. But I kept working on the website on nights and weekends. And then as time went on, the site grew popular. And then in mid-2003, Google launched a program where you could put ads on your site. And so if I had a page about lemurs, there would be, flights to Madagascar. I mean, it's very common now, but, and because the site was popular, it started to generate revenue. And so within about 6 months, the revenue is equal to about half my take-home pay. So I decided to quit my job and pursue my passion and do Mongabay full time. So once I started that, I could create all sorts of other types of content. So one of the first things I did was create a section for children, which I had adapted into about 40 languages by native speakers. But then I also started to take pictures whenever I traveled, because I didn't want to have a problem not having photos again. So I've now posted in probably around 200,000 images on Mongabay. And then I launched a news service, which is what Mongabay is best known for now. Because I saw that there was kind of like a gap between the advocacy materials that are coming out from NGOs and then the mainstream media coverage. So the mainstream media coverage could be quite good, but it was very far. It was just you wouldn't see that much of it. It was just kind of rare for them to cover the Amazon or issues like that. And so I kind of wanted to squeeze into that niche, and that's what I did. Mongabay, started as just me, so it was I was just constantly writing. I was doing a lot of traveling, talking with experts, but it was really just me in my pajamas, writing these articles. But because it got this big following, people, thought of it as being like a larger thing than it was. And then eventually, after about 5 years, I was able to hire someone who was an intern for me, and he joined the team. His name is Jeremy Hance. He still writes for us quite a bit now. But as Eric noted, I had all these ideas I wanted to pursue that there was no advertising business model for. And so I decided to form a nonprofit specifically to start an Indonesian language news service. So the reason I picked Indonesia was I actually didn't speak any Indonesian. I'd done a lot of reporting on Indonesia, but I could see that A lot of the issues for tropical forests and their ecosystems were related to corruption in the management of natural resources. And so I thought that transparency could help drive better accountability in the space, and that there also wasn't much good environmental news coverage that kind of spanned Indonesia. So you might have some in Jakarta or some in Kalimantan, but it didn't span Indonesia. So there is a gap in the market. And so I formed a nonprofit, I got a grant, and then as soon as I got the grant, I notified the world that I was going to be creating this thing. And within a couple of weeks, I had 200 applications from a lot of amazing people. I went over to Indonesia, interviewed folks, and then hired a team. And then within 2 months, the Indonesians launched the site. And within a month of launching, it was the most popular Indonesian language environmental news service. And pretty shortly thereafter, like the president of Indonesia would reference it. So it was getting traction in the key constituencies that we were trying to reach. So it really took off. Indonesia was a really interesting market too, because it was way ahead of other parts of the world in terms of social media adoption. So the Indonesian team could do various things, and we could then test them in other markets, and then bring the rest of Mongabay along. So we learned a lot from Indonesia. I think they learned from us as well. But eventually that led us to branch into other bureaus. So in 2016, we launched Spanish for LATAM. So most of our the bulk of our LATAM team is in either Peru or Colombia, but we also have staff in other countries, and then we have contributors in almost every country across Latin America. We then started an India bureau, which is Hindi and English. Then established a Brazil team, which isn't quite a bureau yet. We have aspirations for that, but that's obviously reporting in Brazilian Portuguese, with a lot of that content that being adapted into English. And then we're just in the process of launching French, specifically targeting key decision makers in West and Central Africa. So that's been kind of the trajectory of Mongabay. This is what our distribution looks like, or our geographic distribution looks like in terms of our staff and contributors. But you'll see that Asia is really the biggest market for us in terms of our capacity to cover stories, but also our readership is the largest in that region, and that's primarily because of Indonesia and India. So just a little bit more on Mongabay. So I already mentioned our main beats, but again, it's forests, oceans, wildlife, the conservation sector, and then how those topics intersect with indigenous and local communities. We produce written articles, video, audio, and then data products. And I've already mentioned our distribution. Our Mongabay readers, so we're not necessarily trying to be as mass market as possible. We're trying to reach key decision makers in certain sectors. A majority of our English traffic is actually international, which is fairly unusual for a US-based environmental media organization. Our readership is more educated than average, and again, we're targeting key decision makers. So who are those decision makers? So it's the world of conservation, so conservation practitioners. So that's NGO staff, rangers in the field, academics, advocacy groups and activists. So that would be like Greenpeace or Global Witness. Educators at all different levels. We actually have an education initiative that's separate from our news initiative. People who manage natural resources, so that might be the people who work in the Ministry of Fisheries or Forests in a place like Indonesia. It's the overseas development agencies, World Bank, USAID, the State Department. People who manage commodity supply chains, so like people at Nestle or Unilever who are thinking about, where is our cacao coming from, or where is our palm oil coming from? The financial sector, so people who are making decisions about what sorts of filters or screens they should be using for their investments, especially when it comes to environment. Philanthropic institutions, and then environmental crime prosecutors and investigators. And so I mentioned that we're not necessarily trying to be as mass market as possible. If we were, we would just be publishing stories about baby tigers and things like that. So we're trying to go deeper onto these issues. That said, the way that we can cut through the various silos of our audiences is we write in a general interest style that's not overly technical. And so that's the way that we end up getting larger traffic, and not quite mainstream traffic, but larger traffic than you would if we were just targeting, one specific vertical. We try to use engaging images and graphics. We use titles that are interesting and descriptive. We publish in multiple languages, and then we target our audience primarily based off topic selection. So again, we're not writing specifically for that audience, but by virtue of focusing on, say, corruption and natural resource in the forestry sector in Peru, you can have real world impact because it's like a relatively small universe. And so if there's like a mayor who's allowing illegal logging in the national park, by shining a spotlight on that activity, it can lead to very rapid outcomes. And we do some specific outreach to audiences as well, via social media or other channels or newsletters. So we have global readership. We're producing content in multiple languages. We use multiple channels. So if we have an investigation, then we'll do various versions of that investigation. So like the long form version, we'll have some short form summaries, like 7 things we learned from this investigation. We'll do short form videos. We might do podcast episodes. So we're trying to reach people in all different ways. As I already mentioned, we syndicate. We're open Creative Commons license. So it means anyone can use our content commercially or non-commercially. And then social media is in a lot of upheaval right now, as I'm sure you're all aware. We're still figuring out our strategy, but 2 years ago, we decided to deprioritize low engagement platforms, which for us was Facebook. So just for context, Facebook was driving around 200 million impressions to us a month, or our Facebook impressions on the channels that we owned was about 200 million impressions a month. Now it's under 100,000. So that's a very significant shift. That has actually had very little impact on us. We've seen a drop in page views, but those page views were not actually driving any actual impact. So it was just kind of garbage traffic. And we've shifted towards higher engagement platforms. So for example, like LinkedIn is sort of, I guess, the most the most specific or niche example, but LinkedIn users tend to often be very engaged. They're because they're representing a company, or like they list their credentials. The level of discourse is very different. But we just found that LinkedIn is like a really great platform for reaching some of our key audiences. So what does this mean for sort of you as you embark on your career? So there's a few communication tips that I think are just really valuable to think about no matter what you're doing. So first is identifying your audience. So who are you going to be trying to reach? So if you're a scientist, depending on where in your career, are you trying to reach like a certain university or like a certain lab in order to eventually get a job there? Or if you publish research and you think it's relevant to the global public, are you trying to reach journalists? Are you trying to reach other researchers in the community? So it's really important to think about that before you do any sort of communicating. Just like, who am I really trying to reach and what are my goals here? Then once you sort of decided who your audience is, how do you connect your work to your target audience? So how do you make it relevant? So why should someone care about whatever your work is? So if I'll get into more about journalism in a minute, but this is really critical, because if you reach out to like an automotive reporter about your study about conservation in Amazon, there's like no relevance, and so you're not going to get any uptake. And that's true with anything. So you just want to be sure that you're figuring out like why your work is going to be relevant to whatever audience you're trying to target. And so then once you do that, like, you need to think about why is this an interesting story? So again, if we're looking specifically from a news standpoint, so how is a journalist going to be able to sell their editor on covering your research? So journalists tend to be inundated by PR agencies and scientists and everyone who's just trying to pitch them on ideas. They're only able to cover a relatively limited number of stories, and they often have to then sell that story to an editor. So they have to say, like, this story is going to resonate with our audience because. And so part of the way you can be successful is explaining why this is an interesting story. Maybe there was a recent news development in the news which is a hook for you. Maybe there was a study that isn't your study, but that you have that's relevant to your work, and so you can be sort of like an outside expert commenting on a study. So why should someone really care about your work, and why is it newsworthy? And so one of the things that can really help is by making your research interesting for someone visually. So that means offering eye-catching visuals, whether those are photos. So if you're doing research on ants in the Amazon, if you've got some really amazing photos of ants, that can be really helpful for selling the story, because maybe that's what's going to convince the editor to sign off on the story. Video, obviously video is really important now for social media. So that's another thing. Illustrations and graphics, things that get people's attention, and then making those things available to a journalist. It can just make it that much easier for a journalist to say yes to you rather than, saying no or just ignoring you. So all that sort of builds together to like this message of making it easy for journalists. And again, I'm speaking here about journalists, but this really applies to a wide range of sort of sectors. So journalists are really busy. They're often on deadline. So you want to make it really easy for them to cover your work. So that means doing things like writing a press release. And so here at UT, you probably have a great press department, which can help you with a press release. So try to get to know those people and be friends with them. If you're publishing research, you want to have a press release go out for, because a press release is really a good way to reach journalists. It just makes it very simple for them to sort of understand what your research is and why it's relevant. And as part of that process, you would normally provide some non-technical quotes, so some sound bites that the average person on the street can understand about your work. And then providing, as I just said, providing pictures and graphics to really illustrate your work in another way beyond just a scientific paper. So even if you don't have a press department, just creating a mass market summary of your paper or your work can be really useful. So I'll get into that in a minute, but just it's a very good thing to do. And there are now tools that make this easier. I'm not necessarily recommending this, but it might be worth experimenting with something like ChatGPT. So plug in your paper to ChatGPT and see what it spits back to you. And that might help you sort of refine whatever sort of mass market summary of your work you want to use. So again, I mean, you don't expect to work the first time, but it can help you sort of refine that process, to make it more accessible. And then if you do start interacting with a journalist, it's really important to be very responsive, because I mean, having done a lot of reporting, if you reach out to, I don't know, 5 scientists to comment on something, and one doesn't get back to you like in a few days, you're much more likely to end up working with the one who does get back to you. So that responsiveness is really critical for the journalism space. You should also be ready to provide comment, and it's important to be able to communicate concisely. So in sound bites, so in language that people can understand. So really summarizing the research or whatever the issue is in a way that makes sense to people. And not using a lot of jargon or taking like 5 paragraphs to explain what you're trying to explain. So I guess the last like key thing to really think about is building a presence. So picking your platforms, and so obviously there's social media. There are faculty websites or department websites. You might have your own website. So those are all places where you can highlight your work and sort of build a presence, which can be really useful for having for journalists to find you in the future. So if you can be listed on sort of like an expert page, in your department, and a journalist is looking for someone to talk about, I don't know, like ecological issues in Texas, and you're on that page, then they may reach out to you. So it's just very helpful to sort of have visibility around you and sort of building a brand, depending on what your goals are. As you all know, like social media can be pretty tricky. You just want to be careful and decide which platforms you want to engage with. Doing all the platforms is possible, but it's hard to do that well. So just kind of sussing out the different platforms and seeing what might fit your personality and the people that you want to engage with, and then starting to build a presence there. So just for example, I personally only use LinkedIn at this point. Like I found LinkedIn is really great for what I'm trying to do, but none of the other platforms are really worth my time at this point for what we're doing with Mongabay. Other people at Mongabay are using other platforms. So a good way to build a presence, on any platform is following some people in your space who you're interested in, whether they're journalists or they're academics. Reaching out to them, starting to try to build relationships. And then another important thing is just knowing what your goals are and then measuring progress against those goals. So if you're just trying to build like a big network of followers, I mean, that's like a perfectly fine goal, but it may not lead to achieving your objective. Like you would just want to be sure that your strategy is aligned with whatever your objectives are. So for us, like, having, 100 million followers would be great, but I don't know if that would necessarily be impactful than having 25,000 really targeted followers. It just might be more to manage, that kind of that fire hose of engagement that's happening. So I don't know if this is relevant, but if you were, trying to pitch Mongabay, this is just very specific to us. So yeah, I don't do reporting really. Well, I don't do substantive reporting or writing anymore, at least not for, the mass market. So I'm not your person to reach out to with story pitches. The best thing to do is identify a writer or editor who covers topics related to your work, and then just contact them directly. So everyone's contact information is on the website. If you can't find that, you can always just reach out to the general editor email address. Best to start with one person rather than copying a whole bunch, because if you copy a whole bunch, then they might all assume that, oh, someone else will deal with this or respond to this, and then no one responds. It's good to keep that initial summary pretty short and to the point. So have like the key messages up at the top, and then you can provide additional context below. But it can be a lot harder to get someone's attention if it's like, 5 paragraphs before they understand, what your ask is or what the pitch is. It's also important to be aware that journalists are increasingly targeted by bad actors. So with malware, hacking, things like that. So a good portion, at least a good portion of Mongabay journalists are not going to click on a link if it's obscured. So if you say like, read my paper and have it be my paper as the hyperlink, that's like a security red flag. So it's much better just have the full URL linking to Nature or whatever it is, because then they can see like where this link is going, and they're more likely to click on it. Same with attachments. So it may be better to just start with a conversation, and then if you get a response from a journalist, then you can start sending attachments and things like that. But it also depends on what you're doing. If you're doing, just regular science, it's kind of lower risk. If you're reporting on, human rights abuses in Latin America or something, it gets, there's a lot more security risk around that than just sort of like straight science. And it's best to wait a few days before following up. So, don't like follow up the next day if someone hasn't replied to you. It might take a little bit of time. I mean, I just wanted to close sort of with, I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. If there aren't questions, there's other stuff I can talk about, but this is just an example of that I like to point to of kind of when all these things come together, how journalism can help contribute to impact. So this is from a few years ago. There was a company that had an IPO in London, and it was a cacao company. So it was the only publicly listed company that was just only doing cacao. And they had this message that they were producing cacao sustainably in partnership with local people in the Amazon and not clearing any forests or anything else. So like, nice story. At the same time, Mongabay had just started using this platform, Global Forest Watch, which had just recently launched. So Global Forest Watch is a place that aggregates data on forests from all different sources. And a lot of that is satellite based. And so we were using the platform to look at potential deforestation based off a vegetation change index. So where there had been changes in tree cover. And we noticed in this part of the Peruvian Amazon, which is one of the most biodiverse parts of Earth, that these pink polygons were popping up. And we thought it was really interesting. We started to dig into it with some researchers. And it turned out that that company that had the IPO was actually clearing primary forest in the Peruvian Amazon. So they appeared to be misleading the public and investors about what they were doing. And so we had the great fortune that scientists had actually been monitoring this area for a while. So there was a researcher who was then at Stanford named Greg Asner, who was doing flights over the Amazon with a with an airplane that had very advanced sensors in it, looking at like a spectrometer, high resolution imagery, and then LiDAR. And so those combinations of technologies, they could map tree species, they could map forests by individual tree species, and then the whole structure of the forest. And so they'd flown over this area and mapped what was there before this started to happen. So when this company called United Cacao claimed that, oh no, we were just like, this forest is already cleared, and this is just junk scrub, basically, we could say, no, we actually like know all the history of this land. And with satellite imagery, we could show the change over time. So it completely countered sort of any kind of argument they had. And so if you look at like high resolution imagery, you can see the individual trees coming down. So it's clearly not just scrub or anything else. This is real forest. And so, we reached out to United Cacao to get their comment on the allegations. We got a response from a top 10 US law firm who told us that they were going to sue us out of existence if we published this story. And because there's all this great science, we just go back to them and say, oh, well, thank you for your message. We have all this data, so I don't know what your complaint is because you don't have libel, you don't have slander. All this is based off real scientific data. And so we're just going to move forward on the story. So I guess you don't have any comments. So we went ahead and published the story. It got a lot of attention internationally. So a whole bunch of other media outlets picked up on it. NGOs started doing campaigns. There were local protests. And it just kind of elevated the work of all these groups that had been in this space around this issue. And so then the Peruvian government eventually suspended the operating license of the company because it was doing illegal stuff. And then 2 years later, the company was delisted from London Stock Exchange. So the reason that was important was they'd been trying to raise capital to clear another 100,000 hectares, so 250,000 acres of forests for oil palm and cacao. So that's a very significant area. If you convert that to CO2 emissions, it's almost 30 million tons of CO2. And so this whole thing, which Mongabay contributed to, avoided these carbon emissions by getting this company delisted and eventually, they shut down, they reincorporated, a bunch of things happened, but the point is that forest has not been cleared. So it was really cool to see all these different players, all contributing to this outcome, which was very positive for the Amazon rainforest. And so if we want to recap some of the elements of success there. So one is there was great scientific data that underpinned this whole thing. Like without that, it would have been much harder to kind of dig into this story. And then it was also well visualized. So a lot of the data was very colorful and, people would look at it and they're like, well, what's going on here? And then it would kind of draw them into the story. It was a compelling storyline. So it was like, a company destroying this indigenous forest. It was full of all sorts of wildlife. So that was another thing that, caught people's attention. There were diverse voices. So everything from, Mongabay did the international reporting, but then other outlets came in like The Guardian, Ojo Publico, and then local NGOs, the Ministry of Environment started getting in. We had scientists. So all these different, again, entities that were kind of part of this process, that contributed to this outcome. And then just the tenacity. So, we decided to, even though we had these threats, we just decided to move forward because we knew we had a strong basis with the science. And so, we just hung on there. There were all sorts of legal threats after our story came out. We just stuck to it. And ultimately, we were successful. So I will leave it there. So we have time for questions. I could provide another example if people want, but I'll just leave it for questions right now.
Thank you so much, Rhett. So I'll just let you go questions.
All right.
It sounds like in your work, there's a lot of like holding powerful people to account. I'm just curious if you've had a lot of pushback, if you've had reporters threatened or other, kind of blowback from the work that you do.
Yeah, so certainly. It sort of depends on the geography. I related actually to the United Cacao case. There was a secret trial that occurred in 2021. I may get the years wrong. So 2021 that our reporter was not aware of, where she was found guilty through this, again, secret trial. We don't know the exact circumstances of it, but it would seem fairly dodgy. So in any case, so what happened was the company said that she had defamed them by referring to their activity as deforestation. And the specific quote was from someone within the ministry, the public prosecutor's office. So she was just quoting someone else. But anyway, so it was pretty weak grounds for sort of this claim. But she was found guilty and was then notified that she was facing this huge fine and potentially a suspended sentence. So we ended up fighting it in court, and then we won because it was a pretty ridiculous example. And so that was significant because it was the first sort of environmental journalism case in the that was a SLAP case where we won. So SLAP is strategic litigation against public participation. So it actually set an important precedent within Peru. We also had another journalist arrested in 2019 in Indonesia. So those are kind of the two most egregious cases. We're pretty accustomed to getting legal threats that don't really go anywhere. It's just someone trying to get content removed from the website. And we just respond to that. We're not an advocacy group. Like, our interest is accuracy. So if we make a mistake, then we're going to correct it. But typically what it is it's just someone doesn't like what we've written and they're just trying to get us to take it. There's some intimidation. We do have a whole internal protocol around safety. So we are very concerned about the safety of our journalists and contributors. And so we try to minimize risk as much as we can. So, again, I named the two worst cases, but generally, we've been able to handle these things pretty well, I would say.
Do you have stories to tell or examples of where your coverage has been prompted mainstream journalism like New York Times or whatever to cover a story?
Yeah, so that happens quite a lot, actually. And so it happens basically in two ways. So one is we're often a source for those publications. So we'll do reporting, and then they'll reach out to us. And so we have sort of a direct evidence of something happening. And then what's more common is a story will appear in the New York Times, and it's something that we covered recently, and they've talked to some of the same sources. So we can sort of infer that we had some sort of influence there. But we have good relationships with various mainstream media outlets, and our goal is just to get information out there. And so we're happy when there is this, additional coverage. But it definitely happens a lot. Where we have the most sort of partnership and direct partnership and sort of syndication with media outlets is actually Latin America. And so, really across Latin America, but especially in sort of the Andean Amazon countries, we just have a lot of mainstream media outlets that are regularly republishing our stories. It doesn't happen in some markets like Indonesia very much. And I think part of it is because a lot of the media outlets are part of conglomerates, which also own palm oil and mining companies. So we don't see as much uptake there. But certainly in Latin America and India, we have a lot of uptake.
So in your example, you had really strong data, really strong evidence to back up the story. Have you ever found yourself or a journalist found themselves in a position where they knew what was going on, but weren't able to show the visuals that were so compelling or have the hard data? Does that complicate the decision-making process?
Oh yeah, definitely. So there's a lot of stories where you know what's going on, but you have sources who won't go on the record. And so you can't move forward with the story. Or if they do go on the record, or even if they're anonymous, doing so will expose them to violence. And so we have to make an editorial call, what are the repercussions of publishing that? And so it makes it a lot more complicated. Also, where there's situations of conflict where, even within indigenous communities, you may have, one faction going against another faction. And so you're essentially taking one person's word against another. And it can be very hard to get that right. And so, journalism, there's a lot of gray zone. It's typically not black and white. Like, this is the example I cited is kind of classic black and white. You can see what's going on, but that's pretty unusual. Normally there's a lot of gray. And so you just want to try to capture what the situation is. But yeah, often there isn't data or there's conflicting data. It's very hard to move forward with something. And also you need to be upfront with, if you do move forward with the reporting, that this data isn't clear. Like, this is what one group's saying, this is what another group's saying, this is what this data said, that's what that data says. So it makes for a more complicated story.
See the future of this type of journalism when you have a big chunk of the population who does not believe in science, and how do you Have you had any example where you actually were successful in reaching out to that public specific?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's a very difficult sort of media environment right now, because you do have a large faction of people who do not believe in science or who think that science is a conspiracy. And it's something we're trying to navigate. So one of the ways historically that we've kind of navigated this issue is, let's say there's people who don't believe in climate change. You can focus on other aspects of climate change, or like what's happening with, say, like soil or things like that, and it will resonate with certain people. So even if you're not talking about the science itself, you're talking about the impacts or people's personal stories, you can sometimes reach across the divide and find those common elements people care about. That said, I think it's getting harder. And I think one of the issues we're going to run into with sort of the rise of generative AI and things is you're going to have highly customized, personalized, fake information or fake news, but then also just like a sea of garbage across the internet and social media. And so which raises two questions. So one is, do people have the skills to discern between what's real and what's not real? So what are the things you need to look for in order to discern the factual basis for something? I think that is teachable. I think it's very hard, but I think the bigger question is, do people care? So, and I'm not convinced, like if you asked me 10 years ago, I would think, oh yeah, everyone cares about facts and trying to understand like what's happening. But I don't believe that anymore. I think a lot of people will believe, will believe whatever narrative they want to believe, regardless of what the facts say. And that's a much harder place to have influence, from a journalism standpoint. And so it's something we're just going to have to navigate. And I think it's probably ultimately going to be around those personal stories and those anecdotes and the narrative rather than like the hard science, because it just doesn't resonate with a lot of people anymore. So it's complicated.
Information on like the journalistic methods behind science communication and stuff like that. I know you majored in economics. Did you do any coursework studying in journalism, or like did you go into conservation science, or was that more of like a hobby or a job?
Yeah, so I actually have no background or qualifications in anything I do, essentially, I would say. Journalism and people, I mean, this is probably controversial, but I think that anyone can be a good journalist. I don't think you necessarily have to go to school for that. I mean, there's great journalists who go to school and, do wonderful work, but I think there's also a lot of great journalists who don't do that. So I think there's different paths. And so that's like an advantage of like in this space, is that almost anyone can do this. In terms of like the environmental science, that's something that's learned. So I feel like, it was something that I learned. I don't have any formal training, but I read experts. I knew people, I read stuff by people who are much smarter and more experienced than I was in that space, and I could pick up on what's important. And then my role as communicator was to then, distill that information into something that other audience could understand. And so I'm sort of like the go-between. So yeah, I know I don't have any formal background in this, but I do think that there's a lot of programs out there, that are free or cheap, that can help you as a scientist learn basic communication skills, like media training is typically what it's called, that I think could be very useful for sort of accelerating that process.
We have a question from Zoom also.
Yeah.
So the question is, given how difficult it can be to connect across from a scientific technical audience to a general audience, and the specific strategies that might be needed for that, what is like the best model for interpreting science across that sort of divide? Like, is the university press office the best place to bridge between the technical and the general, or are there NGOs that do this really well? Is there anything missing in the NGO space that could be a model for doing this, or that Mongabay believes in doing to basically translate from the technical to the general?
So I think in general, university press offices hire people who are very good at this kind of thing. They're good at distilling information in a way that's accessible to sort of a more mainstream audience. That would probably be the first place I'd go to. I think there's just a lot of stuff that you can kind of garner for free off of various platforms like YouTube, or they're people who are on social media who provide these kind of tips. So I think there are formal courses. I don't know them myself very well, but I think there's a lot of places to just pick up basic communication skills that can be very valuable. And then again, I mentioned this, and this didn't exist a year ago, but just experimenting with generative AI, because if you're putting in sort of a defined corpus of text, so you're not having the AI sort of like explore the world where it could bring in misinformation. If you're just putting a paper in and having it, spit out something, just try different things with that. And I think it can be helpful sort of going through that iterative process to learn like, okay, these are the things that are, well, that this AI, which is trained on this huge amount of data, is pulling back and telling me is going to be useful for reaching the mass market. And again, it's probably not going to be quite right, but it can help you in your journey to understanding how to better communicate your work. So those are all probably pretty basic things I think you can do without investing a lot of money or time.
Great. Well, if there are no further questions, just like to say thank you to Rhett again. Again, if you want to be involved in the Texas Tropical Network, please go to our website, texastropicalnetwork.org. You can sign up to be on our email list there. We've got 2 more events coming up this week for the public. So tomorrow, 7 p.m. in the School of Journalism, DMC 2.106, we'll be talking about reporting from nature's front lines, the state of environmental journalism. And then Thursday in this room at 4 p.m., we'll be hearing from Rhett about the state of the world's tropical forests. So thank you all very much. If you sign up for lunch, we'll be walking over to Pat 142, and please take stickers if you'd like them. We have a bunch of them. So thank you all.